Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. Great to have you at Parker Hill today. My name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors here. If we've never met, great to meet you. And by the way, I am just getting over the flu. I am over it, for those of you who I shook your hand today. But my voice still hasn't quite come back, so I hope you'll bear with me. I hope it's not too much of a distraction. Well, today we're beginning a brand new teaching series. It's called Waiting Room. And from now until Easter, we're going to be talking about those times in life when we have no choice but to wait. When you're waiting on something in life to change, when you're waiting on God to come through for you, when you're waiting for life to get back to what you thought it would be. I mean, waiting is very difficult, isn't it? I don't like to wait. And waiting is hard, but what's even harder than waiting is waiting well. It's really difficult to wait well. There was a story in the news last summer, kind of a cute story that I thought was a great picture of what it looks like to wait well. And, excuse me. It's the story of a young couple. Their names are Jeff and Rebecca Payne, and as you can tell from the picture, they got married last year. And after they got married at the church, they hung around, took some pictures, and then they got into their limo that was going to drive them from the church to the venue where the reception was held and where all their guests were waiting for them. But then what happened was they got in the car, went on their way to the reception, but they got stuck in a traffic jam on Interstate 35 in Ohio. Apparently, there had been an accident, and nobody was seriously injured, but it was serious enough of an accident that it stopped traffic for a full 2 hours. So after about an hour of sitting there in their car, they decided to do something. Instead of just, waiting around and being frustrated and complaining, they decided to do what they would have been doing if they had been at the reception. They decided to have their first dance right there on the highway. In fact, there was a guy in a car nearby who found the song for their first dance on Spotify, played it through his stereo, cranked his windows down, and right there on Interstate 35, they had their first dance together as a married couple in the middle of a traffic jam. And by the way, the song was not Life is a Highway, in case you're wondering, from Rascal Flatts. But I thought to myself, you know what, this is a picture of what we're talking about in this series, what we want to see happen. What does it look like to dance in the middle of a traffic jam? What does it look like to wait well? And I'm looking forward to this series. I think it's going to be a great series, some very important principles. So make it a point to be here every single week of this series throughout the month of March. I don't think there's going to be any more snow this year to keep you away. So every single week in the month of March, be here, okay? And we're calling this waiting room because there are seasons of life that feel like a waiting room. And when you're in a waiting room, typically it means four things. Number one, it means this. It means that something is wrong. You're in a waiting room because you're sick and you're not getting better. You're in a waiting room because someone you love is sick and you're waiting to see how the surgery went. You're in a waiting room because your car broke down and you barely limped it into the repair shop. So you're in a waiting room, usually, not always, but because something is wrong. And the second thing that's true about being in a waiting room is that you can't fix it yourself. The over-the-counter medications and the home remedies just didn't do it, so now you've got to see a doctor. You tried to fix everything you could think to fix on a car, which isn't very much, but now you have to take it to a mechanic. So you're sitting in a waiting room because something is wrong and you can't fix it yourself, and that's always kind of humbling. And the third thing that's true in a waiting room is this: you don't know the outcome. Because the mechanic may come back out and say, well, good news, all you need is a battery. Or the mechanic may come back out and say, good news for me, you need an engine. You just don't know what the outcome's going to be. The doctor may do a few tests and say, I'm going to prescribe an antibiotic. Or the doctor may do a few tests and say, I'm going to schedule you for cancer treatment. You don't know the outcome when you're still in the waiting room, and that means there's a lot of fear. One more thing. You're in a waiting room because something is wrong. You can't fix it yourself. You don't know the outcome. And you often feel this way. You wonder if you've been forgotten. Because in a waiting room, time moves slowly. And even if not all that much time has gone by, it feels like a lot of time has gone by because you're waiting for answers. You don't know the outcome. You want to know what you're facing. And so the minutes just creep by and you start to wonder sometimes, did they skip my name on the list? They remember I'm still out here. And you're always tempted to politely tap on that sliding glass window. Say, excuse me, just checking in. Is there anything I need to know? Can you give me any kind of an update? See, this is what it's like in a waiting room. The chairs are uncomfortable, the coffee is stale, the magazines are outdated, and something is wrong that you can't fix yourself, you don't know the outcome, and you wonder if you've been forgotten. And so during this series, we're talking about waiting room experiences of life. Those times in life when something goes wrong, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. And you don't know if it's ever going to get better. And sometimes it feels as if God has forgotten you. I don't know what that might look like for you. It might look like some of you who thought you'd be married by now, but you're still waiting for someone to love, still waiting for Mr. Right. You would actually settle for Mr. Halfway Decent, but nobody's come along yet and you're still waiting. You're waiting for a job to support your family. You're waiting for that day when you can wake up in the morning and the anxiety won't be there anymore. Maybe you find yourself in a situation where you've just been going through a cycle of IVs and hospital beds and insurance claims and long hallways, and you're just waiting for that to be over. Maybe you're waiting for a child who's wayward to turn around and come home. So many people find themselves in these waiting rooms of life. And here's the challenge in that. It's in those waiting room experiences that oftentimes people get tired of waiting and they decide to give up. They give up on God. They give up on faith. They give up on the church. And they just walk away because they look at their circumstances that just don't seem to be changing. And God seems so silent. And they say, I don't know if he even cares anymore. I'm not sure if he was ever even there. That's what can happen in the waiting room. Give you one example of that. Charles Darwin, who is known today as the father of evolution, he wrote a very well-known book, The Origin of Species, that really became foundational for evolutionary thought. But what many people don't know is that Charles Darwin grew up in a Christian home. He actually lived devotedly by Christian principles for much of his life into adulthood. He even married a woman who was a devout Christian. And even as an adult, when his faith began to waver a little bit, he would still go to church every Sunday with his family. But all of that changed in one day. It changed on the day that his 10-year-old daughter, Annie, passed away after a brief illness. On the day he lost his daughter, that was the day he lost his faith. And here's what it says in Darwin's biography. Annie's cruel death destroyed Charles's belief in a moral, just universe. Later, he would say that this period chimed the final death knell for his Christianity. Charles now took his stand as an unbeliever. And it was 8 years later that he published his most famous work, The Origin of Species. You see, it's in those waiting room experiences when our faith can get shaken to the core, because there's always one question that rises to the surface in those times, and it's this question: God, where are you? Do you even care? Do you even notice what's going on in my life? God, where are you? And just if you can have some kind of assurance that God knows and that he really does care, at least for me, sometimes that's enough in and of itself to keep going. So today, as we begin this series, I want to give you one very important principle to apply when you find yourself in the waiting room circumstances of life. This is a principle that I've had to remind myself of many times when I found myself in the waiting room. In fact, I remember writing this in a letter to my mom when we lost my sister to cancer 6 years ago. And it's simply this: that God's inaction is never a sign of his indifference. God's inaction, his failure to act the way you want him to, is not a sign of his indifference. It's not a sign that he doesn't care about you. And this is so important because in those waiting room experiences, the most important thing you can do is try to see God not through your circumstances, but to see your circumstances through what you know about God. And if you begin to assume that his inaction means that he's indifferent towards you, then you're going to walk away at the very time when you need God the most. So I want to talk about this principle today, and I want to illustrate it today from a story in the Bible that if you grew up in church, you may be very familiar with. In fact, I've taught on this passage before, I think 4 or 5 years ago. It's a very powerful, I think, picture of this principle that we're talking about today. And it's the story of a guy named Lazarus. It's in John chapter 11, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It's the 4th biography of Jesus in the Bible. If you have a Bible app with you, go ahead, open that up to John chapter 11. It'd be great just to follow along. But the story here in John chapter 11, it revolves around the death of this man named Lazarus. Now, Lazarus, he was a close friend of Jesus. He lived in a small village called Bethany, a town about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem in Israel. And Lazarus lived there with his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And so Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were like a second family to Jesus. I mean, they were very, very close. So here's what happens, verse 1. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Goes on to say this in verse 3. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Mary and Martha, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, you read that and you discover that Lazarus is sick. And so Mary and Martha find a messenger, probably someone who could run very fast. They send him to Jesus. They send this message, Lord, the one you love is sick. And their assumption is this, that he's going to do something about it. That because he loves them, he will come and help, perhaps heal Lazarus. I mean, you can put it into a formula. Jesus loved Lazarus. Lazarus was sick. Therefore, Jesus healed Lazarus. Makes sense, right? So let's keep reading. Here's verse 6. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he got up and set out for Bethany, taking the 12 with him. And when he came to where Lazarus was lying, he spoke a word and healed him. That's what we want it to say. That's what we think it should say. That's what we expect it to say. That's not actually what it says, though. I made that verse up. That's not actually in the Bible. That's what we think it should say. Let me show you what it really says. And I promise from this point forward, no more tricks. Every verse will actually be in the Bible, okay? Verse 6, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And this is so confusing because you expect this to be a moment when Jesus would show compassion. He's healed hundreds of people, maybe hundreds, at least dozens of people, most of whom were strangers. Certainly he's going to help someone who's his friend. But instead of going where he needed to go, he stayed where he was and ignored the people that he supposedly loved. I mean, even you and I, we can't heal people, but we would at least try to go and be there for somebody that we love. But Jesus stayed where he was. He stayed 2 more days and apparently took his time getting there, because by the time he gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Imagine your child being hit by a car out in front of your home, and you carry that child inside the house and you frantically call 911. And the phone rings and it rings and it rings, but nobody ever answers. That's how Mary and Martha felt. They called 911, but Jesus didn't even pick up. I mean, imagine the scene back there in Bethany. Lazarus is sick. He's dying. And they're saying, it's okay, Lazarus, hang on. We sent someone to find Jesus. I know he's on his way. Just hang on. He'll be here soon. But he never came. And when he finally arrives, I mean, they are deeply disappointed. Listen to what they say. Verse 21, I'm skipping ahead. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary said the same thing. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Do you hear the pain in those words? Do you hear the disappointment in those words? Because the one man who could have done something didn't. The one for whom they had done so much didn't do anything for them at the time they needed him the most. And they can't understand why. Now, if you've been around the Bible for a while, if you grow up in church, you already know the rest of the story, right? You know that something good is going to happen in a little while. There's going to be this amazing miracle. It's all going to turn out fine. Mary and Martha don't know that. They can't read Wikipedia. They don't have the plot summary. All they know is their brother is dead. And they're disappointed. And there have been thousands, there have been perhaps millions of people across the years who have said exactly what they said. Lord, if you had been here, God, where were you? God, if you had kept my father from leaving, maybe I'd know how to be a dad to my kids. God, where were you when those people were doing things to me? I was vulnerable. I was a child. You saw them abusing me and you didn't stop it. God, where were you? If you had stopped it, maybe I wouldn't be so messed up today. God, if you had helped me keep my job, maybe I could make these house payments. God, if you had kept that guy from getting behind the wheel of his car when he was drunk, my daughter might still be here today. God, where were you? See, what do you do when the God who has the last word doesn't speak the word you would hope to hear? You know, when I grew up in church, there was this song that we would sing. It was a hymn. And it went like this. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. Now, please don't be offended if a distant relative of yours wrote that hymn 100 years ago. And if it's your favorite hymn, I'm sorry. But that's ridiculous. Every day sweeter than the day before. Come on, there are days that are downright disappointing, even if you're following Jesus with your whole heart. And when you find yourself in the waiting room of life, here's the thought that comes to mind. God must not care about me. God may not even be there. And if he is, perhaps he's angry or he's at least indifferent. So let me go back. Let me read verses 5 and 6 together. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Jesus loved, but he stayed. He stayed. That's inaction. He loved, but that's not indifference. See, never interpret God's inaction as his indifference. And at those times, when your life is falling apart and you cry out to God and he seems so silent, that does not mean he doesn't care. His inaction is not indifference. And you've got to keep reminding yourself that his heart toward you has not changed. And what happens here is as you keep reading the passage, it becomes clear that there was a reason why Jesus waited. There was something bigger going on here. So I'm going to skip over a section. You can go back and read that little bit of dialogue between Jesus and the disciples. Kind of interesting. But for the sake of time and my voice, let me skip ahead to verse 17. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Okay, so 4 days dead, this guy is at this point. Which was important because there was this superstition in that part of the world that after you died, your spirit lingered over your body for 3 days. And then the spirit left at the end of the 3rd day. It was superstition. So on the 4th day, everybody is pretty much convinced, yeah, he's dead. Not mostly dead for all you Princess Bride fans. He's dead. He's completely dead. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews from Jerusalem had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So just like today, it was very common that people would come and surround a grieving family and try to bring comfort to them. And it was not unusual for them to still be there 4 days later. In fact, It was the Jewish custom that you would stay for 7 days to comfort a grieving family. I want you to notice the word many. Many Jews came from Jerusalem to comfort them. It's very interesting because the last time Jesus had been in the city of Jerusalem, the religious leaders tried to kill him. It wasn't safe for him to go back there. So instead of him going into Jerusalem, he goes to Bethany 2 miles away, and many people from Jerusalem come out to see him. There's something going on here. There's a bigger story being written. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. And I like to imagine in my mind that she went out to meet him with her hand on her hip, because she had a little speech all ready for him. She said to him, Lord, Mr. Jesus, glad you could come. Fashionably late, I see. Because if you had been here, in other words, if you had been here when we asked you to come, did you get our text message, or was the coverage a little spotty over there? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And I think she said it that way. I really do. She's disappointed. She can't understand this. And yet, in spite of her disappointment, this is amazing, there's also this thread of hope. There's also this underlying foundation of faith, because she goes on to say this, but I know that even now, even though he's dead, even now, God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She's like, yeah, I know he's in a better place. And I know we're going to be reunited again someday. I know all that. But Jesus goes on to say this. Jesus said to her, no, I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, the resurrection is not just a far-off event. I have resurrection power. I am the power of the resurrection standing in front of you. I'm the resurrection and the life, he said. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? See, he's speaking to her on an intellectual, philosophical level. And she goes on to say this, verse 27, yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Now, it's so interesting to me. If you study this carefully, you'll notice that Jesus cares so deeply about Martha and Mary that he treats each of them individually. And if you read the Bible, Martha and Mary were sisters, but like most sisters, same DNA, same parents, but two very different personalities. Martha was a thinker, and so Jesus comforts her by approaching this whole thing from a more theological, intellectual, philosophical stance. Mary, on the other hand, was not a thinker. Mary was a feeler. So he relates to her differently. Keep reading here in verse 28. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Verse 32. Skip ahead a little bit. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, same exact words, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But Mary doesn't say those words with any kind of an edge on it. Mary says these words with deep grief and with tears flowing down her face when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. When I was a kid growing up in church, this was one of my favorite verses in the Bible right here. Jesus wept. You know why? Because we used to get prizes for memorizing verses in church. And this is the shortest verse in the Bible. That was easy money right there. Right there. That was the only significance it had to me as a child. But you know what? I've grown up, and I've seen a lot of life, and I've seen a lot of hurt. That is still one of my favorite verses in the Bible, but for a very different reason. I mean, think about this. Does it seem strange at all to you that Jesus wept? Because he knew what was about to happen. He knew what he was about to do. I mean, he knew that in about 10 minutes, Lazarus was going to be back on his feet, walking around signing autographs and telling stories. Jesus knew that. So why is he weeping? He knows it's going to be fine. See, he's not weeping for himself. Look at verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. See, he wasn't crying for himself. He was weeping because he saw the pain that they were feeling. And even though the pain they were feeling was pain that only became possible because he delayed, because he allowed it to happen, he was still not indifferent to their pain. And I think maybe even in their tears, he saw the tears of all the ages. He saw the tears, the weeping of every broken heart. He saw the tears that come from all the damage that's been done in this broken world. And he was not emotionally distant. He wept. And that is so profound to me. And I don't know what's more profound here, a man who raises the dead or a God who weeps. That even in our lives, when there are things that we can't understand, when God allows things to happen in our lives that we wish he had not allowed, that does not mean that he's indifferent to our pain and our suffering. I believe that he weeps right along with us. You know, back during the Civil War, when a man would go off to battle, sometimes his wife would buy a small bottle like the one in this picture. This was called a tear bottle. And what would happen is this, that she would keep this nearby, sometimes on a string around her neck. And maybe late at night when she couldn't sleep and she was wondering about her husband, where he was, whether he might be injured or lying dead somewhere on a battlefield, feeling so lonely. And when she began to weep, she would take that tear bottle and try to catch her tears. And then she would plug that bottle and save it for the day when her husband would come home. And she would say, "Here are the tears I cried for you when you were fighting your battles." And I love to imagine that there will come a day, someday, when we will step into eternity, and God will someday show us, these are the tears I cried for you when it seemed like I wasn't there, when it seemed like I wasn't involved in your life, when you were fighting your battles. These are the tears I cried for you. Let's continue the story. See how it ends here. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Because guys generally have a bad odor anyway. Then 4 days of death, that really makes it a whole lot worse. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, my old friend, come out." And like I've said before, he had to say Lazarus, because if he didn't say Lazarus, he would have emptied every tomb within hearing distance. "Lazarus, come out." His heart begins to beat. Blood begins to course through his veins. He takes a breath. His eyes open. He's confused. If I'm alive, why am I in a tomb? If I'm dead, why do I have to go to the bathroom? The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." And then here's how it ends. Look at verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. I want you to think about this. Because Jesus waited, Lazarus died. Because Lazarus died, a crowd came to mourn. And because a crowd came to mourn, many people saw the Son of God in the fullness of his power, and they believed. See, there was a much bigger story being written, but Mary and Martha had no way of understanding this until it played all the way out. And let me tell you, there are going to be things that happen in our lives that make no sense to us. And it may not be until we can see the bigger story that it all comes together for us. And sometimes that happens, a few years down the road, God rolls away the stone and it all makes sense. But a lot of times, it won't happen until someday we stand with him in eternity and look back. But in the meantime, I must believe with all my heart, when I can't understand what's happening, when I'm in that waiting room, I must believe that God's heart toward me is unchanged and that his love is unwavering and that his purposes are beyond my understanding. Years ago, when Debbie and I were just starting to get to know each other, I would try to find creative ways to ask her out on a date. And because I figured if I put a lot of work into asking her out, it'd be harder to say no. But one of the things I did one time was I bought a puzzle and I spray painted the whole puzzle white. And then I wrote on it, had somebody who did calligraphy write on it, an invitation to dinner. And then I took the puzzle apart again, and over a week's period of time, I gave her the pieces one or two at a time. Like I gave her some with a flower delivery, put some in there, put a couple in her car from time to time, mailed a few to her in the mail. And at first she's getting these random puzzle pieces, maybe just blank, maybe just with a part of a word on it. But over time, it eventually began to come together. And eventually she realized what it was. And it wasn't until she had all the pieces that she really fully understood that this was an invitation to go out to dinner with the man of her dreams. See? See, I believe that God is at work in human history. And he's writing a message one piece at a time. And sometimes the one or two pieces that we hold, they just don't make a lot of sense to us. But we've got to believe that someday when all the pieces are in place, we'll understand that the one who was writing that message loved us more than we could ever understand. And see, the story of Lazarus and his resurrection is just a glimpse, I think, into the bigger story that God is writing. It's a glimpse of the ultimate restoration that will one day take place. That day, someday, when every cry of pain will be turned into a shout of joy. When every kind of death in this world will have a resurrection. When everything that's broken on this planet will someday again be made whole. When all the pieces will fit together. But until then, we're in the waiting room. And sometimes you're in a season of life when you're in that waiting room. And in those times, you just got to hold on to the truth that God's love for you is unwavering, his heart for you is unchanged, and his purposes are bigger than we can ever understand. And the next time you're in a waiting room situation in your life, just remember you're not alone. Mary and Martha were there. Lazarus was there. Millions of people have been there. In fact, Jesus himself was there. The night before he went to the cross, he prayed a prayer. Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. He said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." And if you ever get frustrated because it seems like God isn't answering your prayer, remember that God didn't answer this prayer. That cup of suffering did not pass from Jesus. He drank that cup of suffering fully. He was arrested that night. He was beaten. And then he was taken and crucified on a Roman cross. And if we had been there standing in the crowd that day, we would have seen him on that cross. And we would have been so confused. Here's Jesus, a man who had done no wrong, who healed the sick, who loved the outcast, who fed the hungry, the very Son of God being crucified. And we would say, God, where are you? God, why is this happening? God, are you absent? How could anything good come from this? But it was only a matter of time until all of human history was able to look back and realize that the moment in time when God seemed most absent was the moment in time when his love was most present. And it was proof of the fact that God's inaction is never a sign of his indifference. As we begin to wrap up today, we want you to hear from somebody who's in the middle of their own waiting room. A young lady who attends our Clark Summit campus and recently became part of our staff here at Parker Hill. Her name is Sarah, and I want you to watch and hear Sarah's story. Watch this with me.
If you would have told me 3 years ago that I'd be single living in Pennsylvania, I probably would have laughed at you, and then I would have been terrified because I didn't want that. I've been married about 2 years. He came home one day from work and he told me this is not easy for me to say. He said, I haven't been happy in a while and I'm just not feeling it anymore. And I said, feeling like what? Like you love me? And he nodded and said, yeah, I don't love you anymore. I was in shock, didn't really know what to say. He left right away. I was just completely blindsided by that news from him, and it took a few months for everything to be final. He was my best friend before we even started dating. Dated for about a year before we were engaged, and then after that we were engaged for almost 2 years before we got married. So I had a pretty easy life until then. Grew up in a Christian home, and this was the first big trial that really defined what I knew about God and what I knew about myself. So for me, that's where my faith got real. He left, and then about a month later, I got proof that there was someone else. God allowed me at certain points to get proof of different things, and it was just little bits at a time. It was never easy. There was a lot of shock and confused emotions. I never thought that it would happen to me. I thought about putting all his stuff on the curb, but I realized that I wanted to stay blameless. And what that looked like for me was not retaliating. For me, I didn't slander him on Facebook. I didn't turn to social media. I realized that I'm still his wife, and I need to honor that commitment that I made. Even though I knew it was ending, I still wanted to honor God through that. There's been some darker times than others. There's a lot of thoughts that try to creep into my head. Thoughts like, this was your fault, you'll never get over this. Those lies and those thoughts try to creep in and try to make me believe that God doesn't know what he's doing. There was a lot of people that told me, I'll be praying for you, it's the least I can do. And I realized it's the most you can do because we have a powerful God. So I should never downplay prayer and the power of God because I felt that power very real. I never really had it out with God about this, strangely enough. I was confused, but I was very aware of his presence and his love because I immediately surrounded myself with the body of believers that I was in. While I didn't understand, I knew that absolute truth of his love and his presence. Even though he doesn't always give me the storybook ending that I want, maybe sometimes he's silent, working in different ways that I don't even know to look for. He is always present with me. He's always faithful, and he pursues me in a very personal way. I'm in a way thankful that it happened because it changed who I am in a good way. And it changed my relationship with God in a very good way. I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I am thankful that it happened to me.